So in this lab, hopefully what you had a chance to see is first mess around with the iControl REST API, just using the IP address of the management port and then MGMT/talk, kind of explore around in there a little bit. Then a bunch of different calls using scripts that are already set up in a Postman tool, and go explore and navigate around using that Postman tool as a way of getting to the big IP and looking at those REST calls from there. At the end, you get a chance to do create more parts of an LTM config, virtual pool, profile, all that stuff, and then hopefully that worked. Okay, so if you didn't totally finish the lab, then we're going to talk through this next section, which is orchestration. And once we get done talking about that, then you can just pick up where you left off on the previous lab, or those of you that are finished, just start exercise 2. Okay? And that'll take us up through lunch. So orchestration, different angle. In that lab that you just did, it was much more based on what you might hear referred to as an imperative type of model, where you had to know a lot about Big IP in order to understand what was going on with those REST API calls. You had to do them in a certain order. For instance, when you're doing your LTM config, you had to do the pool first. Or if you created your own monitor, you had to do the monitor first, then the pool, then profiles, and finally the virtual server. So you not only had to know how to create those objects, but also what order you had to create them in. So very much a imperative type of knowledge that you had to have in order to do things that way. With orchestration, what we're going to talk to you about is a little bit different mode, more of a declarative model where you can step back and not have to know quite as much about the big IP. You still got to know a few things, but not have to know quite as much about the big IP as what you do for imperative. Chris had a real good story about dealing with one of his customers that came to him about how to get educated. So, Chris, could you relay that story about the DevOps guy coming to you and asking about training on big IPs?
Yeah, well, actually, it was at ServiceNow. We were out there meeting with their director of IT, and one of the challenges that he was having was he was trying to make that shift towards enabling their DevOps team to take more control over the configuration and management, well, not management so much, but the configuration of services on Big IP. And this was a few years back, and what he asked was, what training do you have available for my DevOps team to learn how to programmatically interact with the Big IPs? And, that was, at the time, we didn't really have a good answer. It was they had to be Big IP admins in order to understand all of this imperative workflow based on what we call domain-specific knowledge, exactly what Brett was saying, what, configuring monitors, configuring pools, profiles, how those all get stitched together, the dependencies that exist there. So at that time, that was kind of the challenge, and fortunately, with the declarative interfaces, we're moving past that. That greatly reduces the amount of domain-specific knowledge and understanding of what's actually happening on the big IP. It provides just a way to consume services without having to be that.
It just doesn't, that model, if we had to train everybody, it just doesn't scale, right? I mean, we can't go teach everybody big IP. It'd be nice, but we can't. So in declarative, there's a couple angles we want to talk about here, but when you're thinking through this, you end up talking about an appropriate level of abstraction. And a good example is a house, because most people have done something with a house, maybe not built a whole house, but some have some concept of this. If you're going to build a house, on one end of the spectrum, you can start with just the bare bones, and you have to assemble everything yourself, right? You go cut, maybe even you cut the wood even, but it's all, you have to assemble everything. The other end of the spectrum would be, it comes pre-assembled, right? We think that that's not a model, in terms of applications and being able to work with these DevOps groups, imperative versus declarative, that's not a very good model to go, because everybody has to be trained on how to assemble a whole house. in this model, you don't get to choose much. In many cases, you don't even get to choose the color of the walls or the light fixtures or plumbing in terms of what type of bathroom design or kitchen design you want to do. You don't even have some of those choices. So what we're suggesting is we want to kind of be somewhere in the middle, where we give you a framework to understand how you need to interact with the big IP, and yet you have a fair amount of flexibility in the way that you do it. So it's kind of somewhere in between. We think that's the right level of abstraction. Here's another maybe picture that or analogy that kind of depicts this. You have many ways to make a hamburger in this case that we're showing, right? There's all the base ingredients, including, really, if you think about it, how's ketchup made, how's mayonnaise made, right? So you can start with everything from scratch, or but you have to know a lot in order to be able to build all that stuff. Or you come out the other end and you have the whole assembled thing, right? The kind of funny version of this is thinking about it from a fast food drive-through. What happens in that scenario is you come up to the window, right? You have a list, only a smaller list of what your options are, right? You might be able to add things to each one of these options, but not many things. And then some sort of magic happens. I would suggest we don't always really want to know what magic happens inside fast food restaurants, but some sort of magic happens, and you come out the other side with your order. Right? You don't have to know everything about, you have to know what you want. But then you tell them and magic happens and it comes out the other side. So you have some level of choice. Which type of hamburger do I want? Do I want French fries or not? But you're limited in what you can control in this scenario. Right? So kind of a good analogy to what we're trying to achieve with our declarative model on applications, or the big IP part of the app. Okay? So that's what we're going to kind of go through a little bit in lab. Specifically with AS3 is the one part that I want you to focus on, but we'll also do a little bit with Ansible in this lab. So let's talk about those things. A lot of customers are doing this now. They're in the process of trying to figure this out. Why? Because they want to do these things, right? They want to reduce OpEx, scale. In many cases, scaling might mean during the holiday season they need to add throughput and horsepower because they have a lot more customers during the holiday season. And then after Christmas or whatever holiday season they're scaling up for ends, they don't need that until the next year. They don't have to maintain that hardware themselves. So scale is a big deal in many customers' case. And then competition, right? In order to stay relative out there, they often have to get those apps running fast. So time to market is important. AS3 is a thing that F5 has been building for a few years now. It's just the current version of what we're trying to do in this declarative model. And hopefully we'll solve many of those issues for the layer 4 to 7 type of application services that customers need for their apps. The best way to kind of describe it is, we've already talked about this, is we're trying to give these DevOps communities an easy way to go build their apps, right? So that anybody could do it. This is probably a little bit of an exaggeration. But we want to make it easy so that you don't have to have all that big IP domain knowledge in order to build this stuff. The difference that AS3 adds, first off, let's talk about what it is. It's a iControl language extension and uses a bunch of stuff on Node.js that you can just pull in all these libraries to do additional things. It really kind of sits in between them doing their calls, their REST API calls, and whatever big IP device they're trying to use. So it kind of sits in between and will translate. Here's the picture. if you weren't using, without AS3, we just saw there was a bunch of imperative commands that we had to issue in order to control that big IP, right? If we put AS3 in the middle, and it requires a lot of domain knowledge, there's a cost associated with that. It's pretty time consuming and error prone. Over time you can build up your library of calls that you would make, but initially it's going to be quite time consuming and error prone. With AS3, the idea is you do one declarative statement. AS3 grabs that and then will build the appropriate imperative commands for you. You don't have to know that, here, I'm going to go create a virtual. Oh, that has to be last. You don't have to know stuff like that. You just kind of throw everything at AS3 and it'll go reassemble that into the appropriate back-end multiple commands. So that's the idea. If that picture makes sense, then you've got the concept of AS3. Okay? Anything you would add there?
No, other than that many imperative commands. If you're talking to customers, you don't have to expose that. As far as they're concerned, it's a simple, declarative endpoint, and that's pretty much all we do. For you guys, we're masking all of that complexity in the product behind AS3.
Here's another analogy. You guys, I think, saw a preview or a little bit picture of SSLO the other day. And the idea with SSLO or our DDoS Hybrid Defender, the DHD product, is it's still just a big AP, but we're trying to simplify the install down to a point where there's minimal number of steps. We're doing that with multiple things, one of which is IAPS and iControl-LX, and trying to boil it down to a pretty simple GUI picture for how you would configure the device. Kind of the same concept here for automation orchestration. We're not having you have to know everything about how to configure a big IP in order to do this task.
ASC does it support all the products, API and ISA?
Good question. So I have not kept up on where AS3 is at with support of all the products. I know we're good with LTM and ASM, and I haven't kept up with where we're at on the rest. Do you know? Catching up.
So just like anything, as this was developed, first we came out with addressing as many of the first use cases as we could with it, right? And as customer requests come in to add functionality, as we continue to gain time to put those use cases in, it'll just continue to grow. So no, it doesn't necessarily support every use case, but it's getting there. The nice thing is it's developed in 2-week sprints with 1-month releases. So with your customers, if there's anything that they do need, it's very likely that you can get that implemented.
I think so.
Yeah. 2-week sprints, 1-month releases. LTM was first, ASM now, APM also. But also, and the 1-month releases are pretty incredible when you read their release notes. But,
yeah, there's a lot that get done in those release notes.
Yeah, it really is. The agile that we're talking about. But the interesting sort of philosophical point to, I think, take away from the whole declarative model is that when you make a declaration, we used to call them deployments, now we call them declarations. Why? Because we're declaring that I want something to look like this. You will, in your DevOps pipeline, need to do things before you deploy or declare an application. So if there's something that falls outside of that AS3 declaration, you might need to create it first. By creating it first in a way that is idempotent itself, right? So check if it exists. If it doesn't, create it. That means that you can run that script over many, many times, right? If you just have a create script, it's going to fail after the first time. You can reference things that were created previous to the AS3 template. So you have to think about the whole deployment and think, I want to run this deployment, and then, what Brett said, paper new. Then if I want to change anything, I want to blow away my whole device or blow away my whole config and redeploy the whole config. And that's what AS3 allows. Even changes, if you don't blow away the device and you just redeclare, but the declaration is a little bit different, the only thing that gets changed is the difference. So that's the whole point of declarative templates. And they're used by all cloud providers have ARM templates. That's what declarative templates are.
Good?
Yeah.
Good question. I have not heard an update, so I didn't know the answer. So I think we've already talked about most of the bullets here. Definitely simplifies automation orchestration using AS3. I think we kind of mentioned all that stuff. Here, we're trying to get to the point where this is a sample AS3 declaration, and a couple things that might be worth pointing out are, first, we're doing a application service, HTTP application service. Tenants is one part of the actual declaration itself. In this case, we're calling it sample 01. And then this should start looking familiar. We've got a class, a virtual address of a particular IP, right? And then there is a pool associated with that, and there are members associated with the pool. So this blob, for lack of a better word, is a way of throwing the whole thing. And again, notice that the virtual, in our case, the idea of a virtual here is declared first, pool and members later. You just give all of that to AS3, and it'll work out all the details of what needs to happen on the back end and what order.
So what happens, just out of curiosity, you declare a pool, but you don't declare any members. Does it just...
I think
there's a schema that this is compared to when you send a declaration in, and there's certain required fields. So the thing about this is these are atomic transactions. So as AS3 receives this declaration, it will check that it is conforming to the particular schema. And if any part of that deployment will fail, it just doesn't deploy at all. So for that particular question about the no pool members, you just have to see if that's a required input field for that class.
I guess on a bigger level, is there, so obviously the pool has to have members, do you have to define that in a certain order? Or as long as it's there, then the command will execute?
My experience is as long as, so there's different classes in here. You'll notice that define what gets applied. My experience has been that it's very freeform. That it's really not looking for, as long as it's in the right class, it's not really looking for any particular order.
It's 100% true, because that's the whole point of declarative.
not having to do an order.
You said before that you don't want domain expertise, so you have to be a kind of expert to know that, hey, now again, you first need to create the node, then you create the pool with members, then you create a virtual, right? But there, you could, the nesting matters, obviously, but the order is not the point.
But your form, your captures where you make sure that that's your requirements met, right? If you don't include the form,
Correct. Yeah.
it's not gonna work. So if somebody's trying to feed data in and they don't have all their data, they're not gonna get a deployment because it'll be like, this is required. This field is required.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so you'll see, the great thing is that it's very freeform in that respect. The bad part about it is that as you're learning this, you'll go out and you'll look at sample declarations, what we have out of docs and other declarations from other SEs and whatnot, and they will be very different in how they look. So sometimes when you're getting used to this, there's a little untangling because it's not necessarily uniform what each declaration might look like. So keep that in mind. And I just found a format that works for me, but other people use maybe different formats.
How familiar does one have to be with Node.js this is Node.js, right? Right. To really make sense of everything that's going on?
It's not Node.js.
Huh?
It's enabled by Node.js, but that's JSON.
That's JSON, yeah. So.
Well, even that too, right?
No, it's two separate concepts. So that's a static text file.
That's config.
Yeah, you could write that in Notepad, or more ideally, you use some sort of editor, but it's just a JSON text file. But underlying what implements that really doesn't matter, right? So if I was to change some of the things, deploy that to Azure, that could deploy a virtual machine, or deploy to Kubernetes, that could deploy Kubernetes cluster. But they're all different engines underneath. Happens to be Node.js.
All right, so let me refine my question. When you put this configuration into something, right, are these schemas going to change depending on, like, is there a common syntax with JSON that determines these configs, or is the config style going to change depending on
the environment?
Yeah.
No, so JSON is like XML. So this XML is just a way to represent data. JSON, same thing. You can switch between it if you want to. So you're going to know JSON, but all, like any cloud provider, their JSON syntax is the same. So those square brackets always represent arrays, etc. There's nesting with those other brackets. So, sorry, you have to know JSON. What was it? Oh, and then how do you deploy it? So,
which environment?
You make a REST request. So you got HTTP GET, which is getting something. There's no body, but a put or a put request or a post request. There's a body, and you're posting that data. So you literally just take that JSON and put it in the post it, and that's how you do it.
Whether it's to a Kubernetes or a different environment, same thing.
Like AS3.
Yeah, like AS3. AS3. Yep. There was something else I was going to talk about, but I forgot what it was. Good questions. We'll get there. One of the steps is that we're going to do in lab is actually install AS3 on the big IP that you've been using. And yet that's not necessarily a requirement for all environments. You could be running AS3 somewhere else. We're going to do it on big IP, but you could be doing it a different way if you wanted. We're going to go through the steps of actually downloading from GitHub, downloading AS3 from GitHub. And then you can either use the REST API to actually install it, or the GUI, or do it a command prompt. Any one of those will work. We're gonna do one in lab here in a minute, and then you can go see these things show up in the GUI, like which AS3 version we're doing here. There's a command we're going to issue just to turn that or enable that in the GUI, and then you'll be able to go in under parts of the GUI and see what's there and add that. Okay, so we'll do all of these steps in lab. I think that's covering what you. This is a good picture version of how you might do AS3. So either it could be installed on a big IP and used that way, or it could be a gateway kind of to deploying in other environments, so other cloud environments, or to Docker containers as an example, or you could do it on BigIQ. So AS3 can reside multiple different places. You choose how you want to then have it kick off things on other platforms.
Where do you install it to push configs out to the cloud?
You would do that on some, like a Linux host, if you wanted to, as an example. Okay?
It can reach all your clouds.
Yeah, right. Right. Anyway, there's options, okay? This is a kind of busy chart, but we've got all these different environments and tools that we might be, or that our customers might be using. All of those can be input to then AS3 as an extension, which would do the work of doing the REST API calls and either creating big IPs from scratch, that's an option, or just changing the configurations, adding virtuals, pools, adding ASM security policies to applications as an example, and implementing that on some platform out there or some big IP out there, whether it be at hardware or VE somewhere. Okay? So kind of AS3 is the throughput that pushes that stuff out for you no matter where it's residing. Ansible. So real quick on Ansible, we're not going to make this into an Ansible class. By the way, you guys have the option of how many people have Linux Academy IDs already? Good. Okay, so that's happening more automatically than it has. If you don't, ask me about it at lab or break, and all of you are eligible to get a Linux Academy ID. We have all sorts of training out there on AWS, Azure, but also some of the tool or container platforms like Docker and Ansible, and you're allowed to go use that training.
And my trainers and the different daters are the admins for the
Okay.
their accounts.
Okay. So, Marco, if you didn't have one, you could talk to Andy. I think you're the only one in APAC, right? No, you guys. If you guys have need help with getting a Linux Academy ID, you could talk to Andy. Well, see, now you've met the person in charge. Okay. So with Ansible, the idea here is that there's 3 high-level elements. There's an inventory. That's the first part you need to know. There's modules that are kind of part of your workshop, and then there's this thing called a playbook. Playbook is where it all comes together, at least for Ansible, kind of similar to the templates that you might, like CloudFormation templates that you might use in other environments. We ship, for free, we ship, I think the count is higher now, but in the 2.3 version of Ansible, we shipped 38 modules, playbooks that were part of the F5 playbook. So we have things for doing device deployment, like VLANs, self-IPs, all that stuff. Doing LTM features, like virtuals pools, DNS, or there's more for ASM also that I haven't got listed here.
Is this for Tower or is this for open source Ansible?
I do not know the answer for that.
Tower, with Tower, you have to buy the network module, right?
I don't think you have to have Tower. This is open source, so ours work on the open source also. Okay.
Tower is just the enterprise version. The Tower is using Ansible, and the module is not a playbook. It's a way to do stuff on the device. And basically, with the playbook, you call the module so that you don't have to write all the stuff. But it's free. It's available.
That's the main question. Is
you can install Ansible on any Linux
and use these.
Yeah, I've got Ansible running in the lab.
When we do the lab here in a minute, the way this particular lab was built uses Ansible Tower, but my memory was exactly what these guys said, which is these could be used in just open source without the license.
Anyway, for Ansible Tower, there is an open source version that is called AWX. That is exactly like Ansible Tower. If you don't want to pay the license, you can use AWX, use the same stuff.
AWX?
AWX, yes.
Cool, thank you.
Good? So, as we said, in our particular lab, we're going to use Ansible Tower, but you could use it in a different, could do it with just base Ansible. This is just kind of a high-level view of how this is wired together for our lab. And that leads us to the lab. The next lab, again, you're going to be doing some things in that Postman tool, but this time, rather than sending that REST API call to BigIP directly, we're going to first, before we explore AS3, we're going to actually install it. There's a few steps in there to actually install AS3. Then the Postman calls that you're going to make are actually going to be AS3 calls. So we'll mess around with that a little bit, and then finally at the end, you'll have a chance to do some stuff with Ansible. Okay, so that's the lab in exercise 2, and you have until lunch or even some time after lunch if you need it. And if you didn't finish the exercise 1, just pick up where you left off. Okay, any questions before kind of release you to lab and? Okay, we'll fix it.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to not do the lab.
Okay.
I'm going to focus on the presentation.
Okay.
And I'll figure out how to get this lab.
Okay.
Yeah.